Picture Mount Everest standing almost 29,000 feet tall above sea level. Now flip that height straight down into the ocean and keep going another 7,000 feet deeper. That is the Challenger Deep in the Mariana Trench, the single lowest point in any ocean on Earth. In 1960, two men climbed into a small steel sphere and headed straight for it with technology that had never been tested at those depths before. There were no advanced robots or high-definition cameras waiting on the surface to record every second. Just a handful of engineers and sailors who believed the same basic idea that carried men into the stratosphere could carry them into the crushing dark below. What they did that day still stands as one of the most extreme journeys any human has ever completed on this planet. Auguste Piccard was already famous in the early 1930s for flying sealed aluminum spheres under balloons into the stratosphere, where the air pressure drops almost to nothing. He realized the same pressure sphere principle could be turned upside down for the deep ocean, where pressure grows instead of shrinks. Instead of fighting the vacuum outside, the sphere would have to withstand thousands of pounds per square inch pushing inward. Auguste designed the bathyscaphe around that insight, a large float filled with gasoline for buoyancy and a small steel crew sphere hanging underneath. His son Jacques worked right beside him through every refinement, learning the vessel inside and out until he became its main pilot and strongest advocate. The two men spent years testing and improving the concept before it was ready for the real test. In 1958, the United States Navy purchased the Trieste from the Piccards for about $250,000 and shipped it to the Naval Electronics Laboratory in San Diego. They launched Project Necton with one clear goal: to reach the bottom of the Challenger Deep near Guam, a spot already known to be roughly 36,000 feet down. That depth is greater than the height of Mount Everest turned upside down and dropped into the sea. The Navy wanted to prove a manned craft could operate there and gather basic scientific data along the way. Refitting began immediately because the original design still needed upgrades to survive the final miles of pressure. Everyone understood this would be the most demanding dive the bathyscaphe had ever attempted. A bathyscaphe does not swim like a submarine. It is built to sink straight down and rise straight back up. The main body is a huge float tank filled with gasoline, because gasoline is lighter than water and barely compresses under pressure, giving steady buoyancy without needing thick walls. Suspended below that float sits a small steel pressure sphere just 2 meters across that holds the crew. The sphere is the only part that has to resist the full force of the deep ocean. When the crew wants to descend, they open valves and let seawater flood ballast tanks. When they want to ascend, they drop iron pellets or release other ballast. That simple system is what carried Piccard and Walsh all the way to the bottom and back. Lieutenant Don Walsh served as officer in charge even though he had never piloted a bathyscaphe before volunteering for the project. Dr. Andreas Rechnitzer acted as scientist in charge, and Lieutenant Larry Shoemaker worked as assistant officer in charge. Jacques Piccard stayed on as technical advisor and co-pilot because no one knew the vessel better than he did. The four men spent months together testing systems and learning how the refitted Trieste behaved at greater and greater depths. Each brought different skills, but they all shared the same understanding that one mistake at extreme pressure could be fatal. Their teamwork turned a borrowed research craft into a machine capable of touching the deepest seafloor. Throughout November 1959, the team ran a series of test dives off Guam to work out problems before the record attempt. On November 15, they reached roughly 18,150 feet, already deeper than almost any previous manned dive. They treated that plunge as a routine proving run, checking every valve, every ballast release, and every instrument reading under real pressure. Each successful test gave them more confidence that the sphere could handle the final miles. They fixed small leaks, adjusted sink rates, and learned how the vessel responded when the ocean tried to crush it. By the time they finished the trials, the crew felt ready to push for the absolute bottom. On January 23, 1960, Piccard and Walsh climbed into the 2-meter steel sphere at Guam and sealed the hatch at 8:23 in the morning. They controlled the sink rate to about 0.9 meters per second. fast enough to make progress, yet slow enough to avoid slamming into the bottom. The descent lasted 4 hours and 47 minutes. Inside the sphere, the air grew cold and damp, while the only light came from a few small instrument bulbs. Outside, the pressure climbed with every meter until the hull began to creak and pop under the strain. They sat in near total darkness, listening to the sounds of the vessel settling deeper, knowing there was no quick way back to the surface if anything failed. Around 9,000 meters, roughly 30,000 feet down, a sudden loud bang shook the entire sphere. The two men froze for a moment, checking every gauge and every reading they could see. Their sink rate had not changed, so whatever had happened had not damaged the main pressure hull or the ballast system. They decided to keep descending even though they had no idea what had caused the noise. Hours later, when they finally surfaced, they learned that one of the outer plexiglass window panes in the entrance tunnel above the sphere had cracked under the pressure. At the time, they simply noted the event, stayed calm, and continued the dive. At 1:06 in the afternoon, Trieste settled onto the sediment of the Challenger Deep. Instruments showed a record depth, later refined to about 35,800 feet, the lowest point in any ocean on Earth. They spent roughly 20 minutes on the bottom, eating chocolate bars and taking readings while the floodlights lit a small circle of gray ooze. A flat, soul-like fish glided through the light and disappeared into the darkness. That single sighting made headlines around the world because it suggested complex life could survive, even at the most extreme depth. They stayed long enough to confirm the instruments and then prepared to release ballast for the long climb back. Marine biologists today still debate whether that flatfish could have existed at such pressure and depth. Some researchers argue the skeletal structure of a true fish would collapse under those conditions, and suggest the men may have seen a sea cucumber or another invertebrate instead. The question has never been fully settled either way, yet the uncertainty does not erase what Piccard and Walsh actually proved. They demonstrated that something alive moved across the seafloor at the deepest known point on the planet. That single observation opened the door to decades of later study about life in the Hadal zone. After 20 minutes on the bottom, they released ballast and began the ascent. The climb took 3 hours and 15 minutes. The entire round trip, descent, bottom time, and ascent, lasted just under 9 hours. When they broke the surface, the world learned they had reached the deepest place any human had ever gone. Both men received personal decorations from the U.S. Navy along with Legion of Merit honors for the achievement. Newspapers carried the story worldwide as proof that humanity could still touch the last untouched extremes of its own planet. No one returned to the Challenger Deep for the next 52 years. The absence was not simple neglect. A dive like Trieste's was staggeringly expensive, genuinely dangerous, and offered no immediate military or commercial payoff. Unlike the space race unfolding in the sky at the same time, there was no rival superpower racing to repeat the feat. The technology existed only in one vessel that had already done its job, so the record stood alone while the world looked upward instead of downward. It would take new private funding and new engineering decades later to make another attempt. On March 26, 2012, filmmaker James Cameron piloted the solo submersible deep-sea Challenger to the same bottom, becoming only the third human ever to reach the Challenger Deep and the first to go alone. Starting in 2019, private explorer Victor Vescovo made multiple further descents as part of his 5 Deeps expedition using newer submersibles. The deepest point on Earth, visited exactly once in half a century, suddenly became reachable several more times with technology built long after Trieste. Each new dive built on the original proof that the extreme environment could be entered and survived. Jacques Piccard continued working in oceanography for decades after the dive. He helped design the bathyscaphe Ben Franklin, and in 1969 led a crew that drifted submerged with the Gulf Stream for nearly a month gathering data. Later, he founded a foundation dedicated to studying and protecting seas and lakes. He died in 2008 at the age of 86, leaving behind a lifetime of work that began with his father's balloon flights and ended with real efforts to understand the oceans. His name remains tied to the first successful descent into the Challenger Deep. Don Walsh stayed in the Navy, earned a PhD in oceanography, and became one of the world's leading voices for deep-sea exploration. He advised expeditions, mentored younger explorers, and even met James Cameron years after Cameron's own dive. He received numerous honors for a lifetime spent championing the deep ocean. Walsh died in 2023 at age 92. The last living link to the original 1960 descent, the bathyscaphe Trieste itself, was retired and is now preserved on public display at the National Museum of the U.S. Navy in Washington, D.C. Follow Sourbud's Den for more real stories.